What is the true measure of a nation's soul? It is not found in the marble halls of its government or the towering steel and glass of its financial centers. It is not measured by the thunderous applause in stadiums or the hushed reverence in museums. The cold, hard truth of America is often found under the harsh fluorescent lights of a local grocery store, in the quiet desperation of a gas station at midnight, or in the stark, lonely silence of a rural mailbox at the end of a long, unpaved driveway. It is in these places that the promises made and the debts owed are laid bare. For Sergeant Major Arthur Pendleton, retired, the soul of his nation felt as cold and brittle as the November wind that whipped across the barren potato fields surrounding his small, beleaguered home. The wind was a bully. It rattled the single-pane windows, moaned under the eaves, and seemed to claw at the very foundations of the house, seeking entry. It was a war of attrition, and the house, like its sole occupant, was losing. Arthur sat in his worn armchair, a threadbare afghan pulled up to his chin. The wool was scratchy and thin, a ghost of the warmth his wife, Eleanor, had woven into it decades ago. Everything in the house was a ghost now. Her scent in the closet, the faint indentation on her side of the bed he could no longer bring himself to sleep on, the collection of porcelain birds on the mantelpiece, now coated in a fine layer of dust he lacked the energy to wipe away. The cold was more than just a lack of heat. He'd run out of heating oil last week, and the small pile of wood for the stove was dwindling with alarming speed. This cold was deeper. It was a bone-deep chill that had little to do with the temperature. It was the cold of absence, the cold of fear, the cold of a future that had narrowed to a single, terrifying point. He stared at the photograph on the wall. A younger Arthur, barely 20, stood ramrod straight in his dress uniform, the jungles of Vietnam still a world away. He was smiling, a confident, invincible grin. Next to it, another photo. Captain Arthur Pendleton, receiving the Silver Star. His face was harder then, the eyes holding a knowledge he wished he could forget, but the pride was unmistakable. He had served. He had sacrificed. He had believed in the promise. Now, his hands, gnarled with arthritis and trembling slightly, rested on a different kind of official paper. It wasn't a commendation. It was a foreclosure notice. The formal, unfeeling language was a stark contrast to the flowery, reassuring words of the man who had visited him a few months ago. Mr. Silas Croft. He had arrived in a car as sleek and black as a panther, his suit impossibly crisp, his smile a blindingly white, perfectly calibrated thing. He had called himself a veteran wealth advocate. He had a file with Arthur's service record. He spoke of honoring heroes, of unlocking the equity tied up in a lifetime of service. He used words like reverse mortgage and legacy protection. He had looked at Eleanor's porcelain birds and spoken of their sentimental and market value. Arthur, his mind clouded with grief and the constant, grinding worry of medical bills from Eleanor's long illness, had listened. He had been so tired. Tired of fighting the bank, tired of the single-serving frozen dinners, tired of the crushing silence. Croft's voice had been a soothing balm of competence. He had made it all sound so simple, so logical. A way to stay in his home. A way to have peace. He had signed the papers. He had accepted a check that seemed, at the time, like a fortune, but which evaporated with frightening speed against the mountain of debt. He had even, in a moment of profound weakness he now relived every waking hour, allowed Mr. Croft to take Eleanor's jewelry and his own service medals as collateral for a private loan, a little extra to tide him over. Croft had promised they would be stored in a secure vault, an investment. The foreclosure notice was the final, brutal punchline to a joke he had been too foolish to understand. The wealth advocate had advocated only for his own wealth. The legacy he had protected was his own. Arthur was left with nothing but the ghosts and the cold. His stomach growled, a hollow, painful cramp. He hadn't eaten since yesterday morning, the last of the canned soup. He thought about the mailbox. It was a quarter-mile walk down the gravel driveway, a journey that now felt like an expedition to the pole. For weeks, it had been the source of his daily anxiety, each trip a gamble that might bring another bill, another warning. Now, it was his only hope. His small pension check was due. It wouldn't stop the foreclosure, not by a long shot, but it would buy food. It would buy another day. With a groan that seemed to rise from the very earth, he pushed himself up. The room swam for a moment, black spots dancing in his vision. He steadied himself on the arm of the chair, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He pulled on his thin jacket, the zipper snagging halfway up, and wrapped a scarf around his neck. It was Eleanor's. It still smelled faintly of her perfume. The scent was both a comfort and a fresh wound. He opened the door, and the wind hit him like a physical blow, stealing the air from his lungs. He leaned into it, his head down, and began the long, slow shuffle toward the road. Each step was a negotiation. His hip, a constant, fiery ache. His knee, a traitorous, clicking joint. The gravel shifted under his worn boots. The sky was a uniform, unforgiving gray. He was a small, stooped figure in a vast, indifferent landscape. A forgotten soldier fighting one last, lonely battle. He kept his eyes fixed on the red flag of the mailbox, a distant, lonely outpost in the war against despair. Miles away, in a pocket of wilderness carved out of the same unforgiving landscape, another veteran was fighting a different kind of war. This one was internal, a silent, daily struggle against the ghosts of a different conflict. Jack Reardon did not feel the cold. Or rather, he acknowledged it, processed it as a tactical consideration, and disregarded it as a personal discomfort. He was built like a brick wall, a collection of hard angles and dense muscle forged in the crucible of Marine Force recon. His face was a road map of his life, etched with lines of concentration around his eyes and a faint, white scar that cut through his left eyebrow, a memento from a Fallujah rooftop. His hair was cut high and tight, a habit he couldn't break. It was a uniform, even in his self-imposed exile. He stood on the porch of his small, isolated cabin, a mug of black coffee steaming in his hand. The cabin was Spartan, a testament to his needs, not his wants. A bed, a table, a wood stove, and a wall of books on tactics, history, and engineering. There were no photographs, no mementos. His past was not something to be displayed. It was a burden to be carried. The silence of the mountains was what had drawn him here. After years of the constant roar of engines, the crack of gunfire, the screams of the wounded and the dying, the silence was a physical presence. It was a void he was trying to fill, or perhaps a space he was trying to get used to. But the silence was never truly complete. In the quietest moments, the ghosts came. Section the blast. The searing heat. The acrid smell of burnt wiring and cordite. The weight of his spotter, Dave, going limp against him. The final, whispered words that were not for Jack, but for a wife and daughter a world away. Jack had carried Dave's body for 2 miles under fire. He had brought his brother home, but he had left a part of himself behind in that dusty, blood-soaked alley. The part that knew how to live in the world of men, the world of peace and promises. A low whine broke the stillness. Jack looked down. At his feet sat Havoc, a massive German shepherd whose own history was etched into his powerful frame. A jagged scar ran down his flank, a puckered mark on his snout. His eyes, a deep, intelligent amber, were fixed on Jack. They were the eyes of a fellow warrior. Havoc was not a pet. He was a retired multi-purpose canine, an NPC who had served 2 tours sniffing out IEDs. He had saved Jack's life more times than he could count. Now, in this quiet, civilian world, they were saving each other. "Easy, boy," Jack murmured, his voice a low rumble. He rested his hand on the dog's head, the thick fur warm beneath his calloused palm. The bond between them was beyond words, forged in shared danger and mutual respect. Havoc was Jack's anchor to the present, the one living thing that could pull him out of the undertow of his memories. Havoc whined again, a soft but insistent sound, and nudged Jack's hand with his wet nose. It was time. Their routine was as ingrained as morning formation. A long patrol through the woods, checking the perimeter of Jack's self-defined territory. It was a mission, and every mission had a purpose. It kept the ghosts at bay. "All right, gear up," Jack said. Havoc's ears perked. His tail gave a single, solid thump against the wooden porch. The command was a familiar comfort. Jack went inside, his movements economical and precise. He pulled on a heavier jacket, checked the worn leather of his boots, and grabbed a small pack with water, a first aid kit, and some jerky for both of them. It was a ritual. Preparation was survival. Complacency was death. The lessons were carved into his soul. They moved through the trees not like a man and his dog, but like a 2-unit reconnaissance team. Jack's eyes scanned the terrain, noting every broken branch, every track in the soft earth. Havoc moved ahead, his body low to the ground, his nose working constantly, reading the story of the forest in a language Jack could not comprehend but implicitly trusted. This was their peace, a quiet, vigilant existence on the fringes. Jack sought no company, no complications. He had a small pension that covered his minimal needs. He made a monthly trip into the small town of Harmony Creek for supplies, a necessary evil he endured with stoic patience. He exchanged few words, made no friends. He was an observer, a ghost of a different sort, haunting the edges of a world he no longer felt a part of. He asked for nothing, and he offered nothing. His war was over. He was just trying to survive the peace. But the universe, in its infinite and often cruel wisdom, does not always honor the treaties we make with ourselves. It has a way of presenting new wars, new missions, whether we are ready for them or not. For Jack Reardon, the end of his isolation was waiting for him at the end of a long, gravel driveway, standing sentinel next to a lonely, red-flagged mailbox. His new mission was about to begin. The drive into Harmony Creek was a necessary part of the monthly ritual. Jack's old Ford F-250, a beast of a truck with a dented fender and a defiant rumble, handled the winding mountain roads with practiced ease. Havoc sat in the passenger seat, not like a pet on a joyride, but like a co-pilot, his head held high, his eyes scanning the road ahead. He was always on duty. Jack hated the town, not the place itself. It was a typical small American town, with a main street, a hardware store, and a diner that always smelled of stale coffee and bacon grease. He hated the feeling of it. The casual interactions, the unspoken social rules, the way people looked at him. A man his size, with his bearing, always drew stares. They saw a threat, or a curiosity, or a problem. They never saw just a man who wanted to be left alone. He navigated the streets with the same focused detachment he used to navigate a hostile city. He identified potential threats, noted exits, maintained situational awareness. The grocery store was a battlefield of brightly lit aisles and chattering civilians. He moved through it with purpose, grabbing what he needed, his list committed to memory. Flour, coffee, salt, canned goods, a large bag of high-protein dog food. His cart was a study in survivalist efficiency. It was on the way back, as the truck climbed back into the hills, leaving the small cluster of civilization behind, that the routine was shattered. They were on a stretch of road that ran through open farmland, the fields brown and fallow under the gray sky. A cold drizzle had begun to fall, slicking the asphalt. Havoc, who had been sitting quietly, suddenly stiffened. It wasn't a dramatic movement. It was a subtle shift in posture that any other person would have missed. His ears, which had been relaxed, swiveled forward like twin radar dishes. A low, almost inaudible whine emanated from his chest. His eyes were locked on something outside the truck. Jack slowed the Ford, his own senses instantly on high alert. He trusted Havoc's instincts more than he trusted most people. The dog had detected hidden explosives in the dust of Afghanistan. He could certainly detect trouble in rural America. "What is it, boy?" Jack's voice was calm, a quiet rumble. Havoc didn't look at him. His entire being was focused on a point about 100 yards ahead, on the right side of the road. It was a mailbox, perched on a weathered wooden post at the end of a long, rutted driveway. A small, hunched figure was just reaching it. Jack saw the old man, saw the way he fumbled with the latch, his movements slow and pained. He saw the thin jacket, inadequate for the biting wind and cold rain. He saw the man pull out a single white envelope, stare at it for a long moment, and then his shoulders slumped, a visible, physical manifestation of defeat. Then the man swayed. He stumbled once, catching himself on the mailbox post. He took a hesitant step back toward the house, then another, before his legs seemed to give out from under him. He crumpled to the ground in a slow, graceless heap, landing in the muddy gravel at the edge of the driveway. Before Jack had even fully processed the scene, Havoc let out a single, sharp bark. It was not a cry of aggression. It was an alert, a command. "Man down." Jack pulled the truck onto the soft shoulder, the tires crunching on the wet gravel. He didn't hesitate. He didn't weigh the pros and cons of getting involved. The training was too deep, the instinct too ingrained. You don't leave a man behind. You don't ignore a man down. Stay, he commanded Havoc, and swung open the heavy door of the truck. The rain was colder than he expected, plastering his short hair to his scalp as he jogged across the road. He moved with a deceptive speed, his long legs eating up the distance. As he got closer, he could see the man was conscious, trying to push himself up, but his limbs were trembling too violently. The white envelope was clutched in his hand, already spotted with rain and mud. Jack knelt beside him. "Sir, are you all right?" The man's head came up. His face was pale, his lips tinged with blue. His eyes, clouded with age and confusion, struggled to focus. Just slipped," he rasped, his voice thin and reedy. "Need to get up." "Easy," Jack said, his voice dropping into a calm, authoritative tone he hadn't used in years. "Let's get you out of the rain." He didn't ask for permission. He slid one arm under the man's shoulders and the other under his knees. The man was shockingly light, like a bird, all brittle bones and loose skin. With a grunt of effort that was more for show than necessity, Jack lifted him. The old man let out a small, pained gasp but didn't resist, his body going limp in Jack's arms. As Jack turned toward the house, a dilapidated farmhouse that looked like it was being slowly reclaimed by the earth, he glanced back at his truck. Havoc was no longer inside. The dog was standing beside the open passenger door, one paw on the running board, his body tensed in a perfect vanguard stance. He wasn't looking at Jack. He was scanning the surrounding area, his head moving in slow, deliberate arcs, watching for threats. He was protecting the vehicle. He was covering Jack's back. Even in this, a civilian context, the old protocols held. They were a team, and they had a new, unspoken mission. Jack carried the old man up the cracked concrete steps of the porch and pushed the front door open with his shoulder. The wave of cold that washed over them from inside the house was even more bitter than the wind outside. It was the dead, stagnant cold of a tomb. He carried him through the dim, cluttered living room and gently deposited him in the big armchair, the one that seemed to be the center of the man's universe. The man's eyes fluttered shut, his breath coming in shallow, ragged bursts. The muddy envelope fell from his slack fingers onto the floor. Jack looked around. He took in the dusty surfaces, the stacks of old newspapers, the photos on the wall of a proud young soldier. He saw the empty wood box next to the cold, silent wood stove. He saw the thin, worn-out Afghan. He understood. This wasn't just a fall. This was a collapse. A system shutting down. He went back outside, the rain now coming down in a steady, miserable sheet. He opened the back of his truck and pulled out a thick, wool-lined blanket he kept for emergencies. He also grabbed a sealed bottle of water and 2 high-energy protein bars from his pack. Back inside, he wrapped the old man in the heavy blanket, tucking it in around his frail shoulders. The man's eyes opened again, a flicker of awareness in their depths. "Thank you," he whispered. Don't know what. Don't talk," Jack said, his tone leaving no room for argument. He knelt and picked up the envelope from the floor. It was from a law firm. Through the rain-smeared plastic window, he could see the bold, red letters, "Final Notice." He placed the envelope on the mantelpiece, next to a porcelain bluebird. Then he turned his attention back to the immediate problem. Warmth. Fuel. He went to the wood stove and opened it. Cold ashes. He found the woodpile outside, a pathetic, sodden collection of twigs and a few larger logs. Not nearly enough. He took what was there, carried it inside, and expertly began to build a fire, using a piece of newspaper and the fire starter from his pack. Within minutes, a small, courageous flame was battling the gloom. He opened the water bottle and held it to the old man's lips. "Sip this." Slowly. The man obeyed, drinking with a thirst that was painful to watch. "My name is Arthur," the man said, his voice a little stronger now that the water had lubricated his throat. "Arthur Pendleton." Jack nodded. He didn't offer his own name. It wasn't relevant. "Rest, Arthur." He broke off a small piece of the protein bar and handed it to him. "Eat this." As Arthur nibbled on the bar with the slow deliberation of a man reacquainting himself with the act of eating, Jack moved through the small house. His movements were not nosy, they were a tactical assessment. He opened the refrigerator. It was empty except for a carton of expired milk and a single, withered lemon. The cupboards held a can of beans and a half-empty box of crackers. This was not a one-time crisis. This was the end result of a long, slow siege. Jack returned to the living room. The fire was growing, casting flickering orange light on Arthur's pale face. The small space was already losing some of its tomb-like chill. Arthur's eyes were closed again, but his breathing was deeper, more regular. He was asleep, or perhaps just unconscious. Jack looked at the foreclosure notice on the mantel. He looked at the photograph of the young, proud soldier. He looked at the frail, old man wrapped in his emergency blanket. A cold, hard anger began to build in Jack's chest. It was a familiar feeling. It was the anger he had felt when a supply convoy was late, when a politician's promise proved empty, when a brother fell because of a faulty piece of gear. It was the anger of seeing a promise broken. He walked back out into the rain. Havoc was still on watch, soaked but unwavering. At ease, Jack said quietly. Havoc relaxed his stance, shook his massive body, sending a spray of water into the air, and looked up at Jack, his amber eyes asking the question. What's the mission? New mission, Jack confirmed, as if the dog had spoken aloud. We're not leaving. He went to his truck and made a decision. He wasn't just going to help. He was going to take command. He unloaded a significant portion of his own supplies, firewood from the bed of the truck, bags of groceries, a case of bottled water. He carried it all inside, stacking it neatly by the kitchen door. He worked with a silent, relentless efficiency. He was no longer Jack Reardon, the hermit hiding from his ghosts. He was Gunnery Sergeant Reardon, Force Recon. And he had just found a new platoon of one. He had a man to protect. He had a situation to secure. And somewhere out there was an enemy who had caused this. An enemy he was going to find. The war had come home. Darkness fell, and with it, a deeper quiet settled over the small farmhouse. The fire in the stove crackled and hissed, a warm, living heart in the cold body of the house. Arthur Pendleton slept, a deep, exhausted sleep in the big armchair, aided by the warmth, the small amount of food, and the sheer relief of another presence in the house. Jack sat in a hard-backed kitchen chair he had pulled into the living room, positioning it against the wall where he could observe the room's single door and 2 windows. He didn't rest. He watched. He listened. The house groaned and settled around him. The wind howled outside. He was on watch. Havoc lay on the floor at his feet, not sleeping, but in a state of low-level alertness. His head was on his paws, but his ears twitched at every sound, his eyes occasionally opening to a slit to confirm that all was as it should be. Jack's mind was a whirlwind of tactical analysis. He had established a baseline. Subject: Arthur Pendleton, elderly male, veteran, suffering from malnutrition, exposure, and extreme financial distress. Location: unsecured, isolated dwelling, lacking basic resources. Threat: imminent foreclosure, a symptom of an as yet unidentified primary antagonist. He needed intelligence. When Arthur finally stirred, it was well past midnight. He blinked, his eyes slowly adjusting to the firelight. He saw Jack sitting in the shadows, a large, still silhouette. For a moment, fear flickered in his eyes, the primal fear of a vulnerable man waking to a stranger in his home. "It's all right," Jack said, his voice low and even, not moving from his chair. "You're safe." The fear subsided, replaced by a dawning memory. "The rain, I fell." "You fell?" Jack confirmed. "I brought you in." Arthur looked at the roaring fire, the neat stack of wood beside it, the blanket that was still tucked around him. He looked at the massive dog sleeping peacefully at the stranger's feet. You did all this. You needed a fire," Jack stated simply, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. There was a long silence, broken only by the crackling of the logs. "I don't have any money to pay you," Arthur said, his voice thick with a shame that was more painful than any physical ailment. "I didn't ask for any," Jack replied. He leaned forward slightly, his face illuminated by the fire. His expression was serious, unreadable. "Arthur, I need you to tell me what happened. Not about the fall. About this." He nodded toward the foreclosure notice on the mantelpiece. Arthur's face crumpled. The story poured out of him, not in a torrent, but in a slow, halting trickle of words, each one costing him a piece of his pride. He spoke of Eleanor's sickness, the endless bills, the feeling of drowning. He spoke of Silas Croft, the smooth-tongued savior who had appeared at his darkest hour. "He knew everything about me," Arthur said, his voice a bewildered whisper. He knew my service record, where I was stationed. He said he had a special fund for heroes. He made it sound like an honor. He described the papers, a dizzying stack of legal jargon he hadn't understood. He talked about the collateral loan and the items Croft had taken. Eleanor's wedding ring. My father's watch. My medals. He said they were just for safekeeping. An appraisal for their historical value, a single, hot tear traced a path through the grime on his cheek. I let him take my medals. Jack listened without interruption. His face remained a stony mask, but inside, the cold anger was crystallizing into something harder, sharper. This wasn't just a financial predator. This was a grave robber. A man who feasted on the memories and honor of the dying. He gave me a business card, Arthur said, fumbling in the pocket of his worn trousers. He pulled out a small, creased piece of cardstock and handed it to Jack. The card was thick, expensive, embossed gold lettering on a field of deep black. Silas Croft. Croft Antiquities and Legacy Investments. Honoring the past, securing your future. It listed an address in the city, an hour's drive away, in a district known for its high-end boutiques and financial firms. Jack took the card. It felt slick and unclean in his hand. This was the clue, the first piece of actionable intelligence. Rest now, Arthur, Jack said, his tone shifting. The assessment was over. The planning phase was beginning. I'm going to make some calls. He waited until Arthur had drifted back into a fitful sleep before he moved. He took the business card and his satellite phone, a rugged piece of gear that was another holdover from his former life, and went out onto the porch. The rain had stopped, and the air was crisp and cold. The moon was a sliver of bone behind a scrim of fast-moving clouds. He dialed a number he knew by heart. It rang twice before a voice answered, a voice that was all business, laced with a familiar, cynical humor. The bat signal is lit. I assume the world is ending, or you ran out of coffee. Marcus, Jack said, foregoing any greeting. Wrecker, to what do I owe the pleasure? Don't tell me you pocket-dialed me. The resulting gravitational distortions could throw the planet off its axis. Marcus Wheels de la Cruz had been the comms specialist for Jack's team. He was a genius with anything that had a circuit board. The IED that had taken Dave had also taken both of Marcus's legs. Now, he operated from a basement in San Diego that he called the Lair, a fortress of servers, monitors, and high-speed connections. He was Jack's eyes and ears in a world Jack no longer understood. I have a situation, Jack said, his voice flat. You always have a situation. Is it a need a shovel and some lime situation, or a need you to make a bank disappear situation? Please say the latter. I'm bored. I have a name, Jack said, ignoring the gallows humor. Silas Croft. Company is Croft Antiquities and Legacy Investments. I'm sending you a picture of his business card. He quickly snapped a photo with the phone and sent it. He could hear the clicking of a keyboard on the other end of the line, a sound as rapid and precise as machine gun fire. Silas Croft. Okay, I got him. Public-facing profile is squeaky clean. Philanthropist, art collector, board member for a dozen charities, including a couple of dubious veteran support foundations. Smells like a professional saint. He's a predator, Jack stated. He's targeting elderly veterans, stripping their assets, taking their homes. The clicking stopped. Marcus's tone lost all of its flippancy. Say again, Wrecker. He found a Marine Sergeant Major, Silver Star recipient, Vietnam. Gutted him. Took his house, his wife's jewelry, his medals. Left him to freeze to death. There was a long, cold silence on the line. Marcus might have lost his legs, but he hadn't lost an ounce of his loyalty to the Corps. An attack on one veteran was an attack on the tribe. The man is a parasite feeding on our own, Marcus said, his voice now dangerously quiet. This is not a financial crime, Jack. This is desecration. I need everything you can find, Marcus. Bank records, shell corporations, property deeds. I want to know who he is, what he owns, where he sleeps. I want to know where he keeps his trophies. You mean the medals? Marcus said. Yes, Jack replied. Consider it done, Marcus said. I'm going deep. This guy uses a lot of cutouts and offshore accounts to hide his tracks. Wow, this is sophisticated. He's not just a con man. He's a damn architect of ruin. He's got a whole system. He's pulling data from VA databases. There must be an inside leak to identify vulnerable vets. cross-references them with property records and hospital liens. He's a shark with a spreadsheet. Jack listened, the anger in his chest burning like a cold blue flame. This was worse than he thought. It wasn't just one man's greed. It was a systematic hunt. How many? Jack asked. I'm running the pattern now, Marcus said, the keyboard clicking furiously again. Oh, you are not going to like this. I'm finding dozens of names. All over the state. All elderly vets. All recently widowed or with major medical debt. All their properties have been flipped into a holding company, Patriot Holdings LLC, which traces back to, you guessed it, a shell corporation owned by one Silas Croft. The horrifying revelation landed with the weight of a body bag. This wasn't a skirmish. This was a war zone. Arthur was just the latest casualty. Find me a weak point, Marcus, Jack commanded. I'm going to dismantle his entire operation. But first, I'm getting that soldier's honor back. I'm on it, Marcus said. His office is a fortress of lawyers and security. But his dirty laundry. Everyone has a place they keep their dirty laundry. Give me a few hours. I'll find it. And Jack. Yeah. Give him hell. The line went dead. Jack stood on the porch for a long time, the satellite phone feeling heavy in his hand. The scope of the villainy was staggering. It was a betrayal on every level. A man using the language of patriotism and honor to commit the most dishonorable acts imaginable. He looked up at the cold, distant stars. He thought of Dave. He thought of all the men who had fallen, who had given everything for the promise of a country that would honor their sacrifice. Silas Croft was spitting on their graves. He went back inside. Arthur was still sleeping. Jack pulled the kitchen chair back to its sentinel position. The time for observation was over. The time for action was coming. He was no longer just protecting one man. He was hunting for all of them. The righteous fury that had been kindled now burned like a forge. He was going to take Silas Croft's world, his carefully constructed empire of lies, and he was going to burn it to the ground. Dawn broke gray and reluctant, painting the frost-covered fields in shades of slate and steel. Jack had not slept. He had spent the hours in a state of controlled readiness, his mind aware with planning and logistics. He had formulated a primary objective, secondary objectives, and multiple contingency plans. The mission was clear: locate and retrieve the stolen property, neutralize the antagonist's ability to operate, and ensure the long-term security of the primary asset, Arthur Pendleton. When Arthur awoke, the house was warm, and the air was filled with the unfamiliar but welcome aroma of coffee and frying bacon. Jack had prepared a simple, high-calorie breakfast from his own supplies. He placed a plate piled with eggs, bacon, and a piece of toast on a small table next to Arthur's chair. Eat, he commanded. It was not a request. Arthur looked at the plate, then at Jack, his eyes filled with a weary confusion. I don't know how to thank you. By getting your strength back, Jack replied, his tone clipped but not unkind. We have work to do. While Arthur ate, slowly at first, then with a growing hunger, Jack laid out the first phase of the plan. I'm going out for a while, he said. Havoc will stay with you. He looked down at the big dog, who was sitting patiently by the door, his gaze fixed on Jack. Havoc, watch him. Stay. The dog shifted his gaze to Arthur, then back to Jack, a silent acknowledgement of the transferred command. He walked over to Arthur's chair and lay down, his body positioned between the old man and the door. He was a furry, four-legged security system. He won't let anyone who isn't me through that door, Jack explained. You'll be safe. Jack shrugged on his heavy jacket. He was about to leave when his satellite phone buzzed. It was a text from Marcus. No words, just a string of coordinates and an address. Blackbriar Storage, Unit 217. Climate Controlled. Personal Access Code, 1775. Semper Fi. That was it. The weak point. The place Croft kept his dirty laundry. The number was a dead giveaway. 1775, the year the Marine Corps was founded. Croft was so arrogant, he was using their own history as the key to the tomb where he stored his stolen honor. The disrespect was breathtaking. Change of plans, Jack said to Arthur. I'll be back. He strode out of the house, his movements filled with a new, dangerous purpose. He was no longer just a protector. He was a hunter. The righteous fury had now been given a target. The drive to the city was a study in controlled aggression. Jack pushed the old Ford truck to its limits, the engine roaring in protest as he devoured the miles. He didn't notice the scenery. His mind was a cold, clear machine, processing the intelligence from Marcus, running through infiltration scenarios. Blackbriar Storage was a new, sterile facility on the industrial outskirts of the city. A maze of identical-looking metal buildings behind a high chain-link fence topped with barbed wire. A single, automated gate controlled access. Jack pulled his truck up to the keypad. He didn't belong here. His battered truck was an anomaly in a sea of clean, suburban SUVs and moving vans. He didn't care. He punched in the guest code Marcus had provided, a simple bypass for delivery drivers. The gate slid open with a quiet hum. He followed the numbers to Building C, Unit 217. It was an indoor unit, accessible only through a main door that also required a code. Jack used the same guest code. He was in. The hallway was long, brightly lit, and smelled of concrete and dust. A security camera high on the wall watched him with a single, unblinking eye. He ignored it. Let them watch. Unit 217 had a standard roll-up metal door with a small, digital keypad next to it. Jack entered the code Marcus had found. 1775. There was a soft beep and a click as the lock disengaged. He lifted the heavy door, the metal groaning in protest. The air that hit him was cool and dry, climate-controlled. The unit was about the size of a one-car garage, and it was filled not with boxes and furniture, but with glass display cases, the kind you'd find in a museum. It was a tomb of stolen memories. In one case, there were dozens of purple hearts, laid out on black velvet like captured butterflies. In another, a collection of old photographs, sepia-toned soldiers from World War II, young men in the jungles of Vietnam, grim-faced women in desert camouflage. There were stacks of letters, tied with ribbon, their ink faded with time. And then he saw it. In a central, prominently displayed case was Arthur's legacy. The Silver Star, the Bronze Star, a half-dozen other service medals, all gleaming under the cold fluorescent lights. Next to them, on a small velvet bust, was Eleanor's simple gold locket. Beside that, her wedding ring. Jack stood there for a long moment, the sheer, calculated cruelty of it all washing over him. This wasn't just storage. This was a trophy room. Croft wasn't just stealing these items for their monetary value. He was hoarding them, savoring the power they represented. He was a dragon sleeping on a pile of stolen valor. A cold, precise rage settled over Jack. He took out his phone and photographed everything, documenting the contents of the unit with methodical precision. He sent the photos to Marcus with a simple message: evidence secured. Send to FBI contact. Anonymously. After I'm done. Then, he began to work. He didn't smash the cases. That was too crude, too loud. He had a small toolkit in his truck. He returned with a pry bar and a set of lock picks. With a surgeon's precision, he popped the cheap locks on the display cases. He carefully retrieved Arthur's medals and Eleanor's jewelry, wrapping them in a soft cloth from his pack. He didn't touch anything else. He wasn't a thief. He was a repo man, repossessing a soul. He closed the display case, lowered the unit door, and listened for the click as it locked. He walked out of the facility, past the unblinking eye of the camera, and drove away, leaving no trace of his presence except for an empty space in a rich man's collection of sorrow. His next stop was not back at the farmhouse. His primary objective was complete. Now it was time for the secondary objective, neutralizing the threat. He drove to the address on Croft's business card. It was in the heart of the financial district, a gleaming tower of mirrored glass that reflected the cold, gray sky. The lobby was a cathedral of marble and brushed steel, filled with men and women in expensive suits moving with an air of self-importance. Jack, in his dusty boots, worn jeans, and rugged jacket, was an alien creature in this environment. The security guard at the front desk, a young man with a crisp uniform and a bored expression, took one look at him and stiffened. "Can I help you, sir?" the guard asked, his hand drifting instinctively toward the radio on his belt. "Silas Croft," Jack said. His voice was flat, a statement of fact, not a question. "Do you have an appointment?" Jack just looked at him. He didn't threaten. He didn't raise his voice. He just met the young guard's eyes. The guard saw something in that gaze, something ancient and dangerous that made the hairs on his arms stand up. He saw a man who was not asking for permission, a man for whom a locked door was just a suggestion. "12th floor," the guard said, his voice suddenly a little shaky. He gestured vaguely toward the elevators. Jack nodded once and walked away. He didn't need to be told twice. He rode the elevator in silence, the quiet music a surreal counterpoint to the storm brewing inside him. The 12th floor was hushed and opulent. Thick carpets muffled his footsteps. The air smelled of money and lemon polish. A receptionist sat at a large, modern desk, her face a mask of professional pleasantry. "Good afternoon. Welcome to Croft Investments," she said, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "How may I help you?" Jack walked past her desk as if she were a piece of furniture. "Sir? Sir, you can't go back there," she called after him, her voice rising in alarm. He didn't knock. The door to the corner office was heavy mahogany. He pushed it open and stepped inside. The office was magnificent. One wall was a floor-to-ceiling window offering a panoramic view of the city. The other walls were lined with bookshelves filled with leather-bound volumes and display cases showing off what were presumably the legitimate antiques. Silas Croft sat behind a massive, polished desk, a phone pressed to his ear. He was impeccably dressed in a tailored gray suit, his silver hair perfectly coiffed. He looked up, his face a mask of annoyance at the interruption. "I'm in a meeting," he snapped, holding up a hand to forestall any words from Jack. He spoke into the phone. "Hold on, Charles. Some brute just wandered into my office." He placed the phone on the desk and fixed Jack with a condescending glare. "Who the hell are you? And who let you past my receptionist?" "Security." Jack closed the heavy door behind him. The click of the latch was unnervingly loud in the quiet room. He walked forward until he was standing on the other side of the vast desk, a rugged, immovable object meeting a polished, brittle force. "My name is not important," Jack said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "I'm here on behalf of Sergeant Major Arthur Pendleton." A flicker of something, annoyance, recognition, passed through Croft's eyes, but he quickly masked it. "I'm afraid I don't know who that is. I have many clients. Now, if you'll excuse me, you're trespassing." Jack reached into his jacket and slowly pulled out the cloth-wrapped bundle. He placed it on the polished surface of the desk and unwrapped it. Arthur's silver star gleamed under the office lights, a stark rebuke to the room's sterile opulence. Croft's mask of composure finally cracked. His eyes widened, his face paled. He stared at the metal, then back at Jack, a dawning, terrified understanding on his face. How did you get that?" he stammered. "Unit 217, Jack said quietly. "The access code is a nice touch. Very patriotic." The blood drained from Croft's face. He understood now. This wasn't a random complaint. This was something else entirely. This was a reckoning. His carefully ordered world was being invaded by a force he did not understand and could not control. "Look," he said, trying to regain some semblance of control, his voice taking on a placating tone. "There seems to be a misunderstanding. Whatever that old man told you, it's not true. Everything was perfectly legal. He signed the papers. He signed them under duress, grief-stricken and starving." Jack corrected, his voice like a steel vice. "You're a ghoul, Croft. A parasite in a suit." "Now see here," Croft blustered, trying to rise from his chair. "I'm calling security. I'll have you arrested." Jack didn't move a muscle. He just held Croft's gaze. The confrontation was over before it began. The predator had become the prey. The coward was exposed. Croft sank back into his expensive leather chair, his bravado evaporating like mist. "What do you want?" he whispered, his voice trembling. "Money? Take whatever you want." Jack almost smiled. It was not a pleasant expression. "Oh, I'm not here to take your money, Croft. You are going to give it back." He pulled a second chair up to the desk, turning it to face the computer monitor. "You are going to sit here," Jack commanded, his voice leaving no room for negotiation. "And you are going to initiate a series of wire transfers. You are going to refund every single cent you stole from Arthur Pendleton. Then you are going to pay him for his pain and suffering. We'll call it a punitive damage. Let's say $500,000. A nice round number. 500,000. Croft squawked. "That's insane. I can't just—" "You can," Jack interrupted, his voice dropping another octave. "And you will. Right now. And then, you're going to do the same for every other name on the list from Patriot Holdings LLC. My associate is sending you the file now." As if on cue, a notification popped up on Croft's computer screen. A file named JUDGMENTXLS had been delivered to his desktop. Croft stared at the screen, then at Jack, his face a mask of pure terror. He was trapped. This wasn't a negotiation. It was an unconditional surrender. His empire, built on the suffering of others, was about to be dismantled, not by a team of lawyers or federal agents, but by one very large, very determined man in a dusty jacket. "Get to work," Jack said, settling into the other chair to watch. "It's going to be a long afternoon." The atmosphere in the opulent office grew thick with the stench of fear. Silas Croft, a man accustomed to wielding power through whispers, contracts, and the cold, unfeeling logic of the market, was now a prisoner at his own desk. His new warden was a silent, imposing figure who watched his every move with the unblinking patience of a predator. I can't," Croft stammered, his hands hovering over the keyboard as if it were red hot. "These are large transfers. The bank will flag them. They'll ask questions." "Let them," Jack said, his voice a low, flat monotone. "You can tell them you had a sudden crisis of conscience. A moment of profound philanthropic clarity. I'm sure they'll understand." Croft looked at Jack, searching for a hint of mercy, a crack in the granite facade. He found none. He saw only the cold, hard certainty of a man on a mission. A man who had seen real monsters and was utterly unimpressed by a playground bully in a $1,000 suit. With trembling fingers, Croft began to type. His movements were clumsy, his usual slick confidence completely gone. He navigated the complex security protocols of his own banking software, each click of the mouse a small death. Jack watched, his senses on high alert. He wasn't just watching Croft. He was listening to the sounds of the office outside the door, noting the rhythm of the footfalls, the distant ring of a telephone. He was aware of the security camera in the corner of the room, and he made sure his face was mostly turned away from it, obscured by shadow. He was a ghost in the machine. The first transfer was to Arthur Pendleton. Croft entered the account number Jack provided, Arthur's own, which Jack had found on a bank statement in the house. He typed in the amount for the refund of the initial loan, then hesitated at the next screen. The 500,000, Croft whispered. "It will liquidate my primary operating account. Then it's a good thing you have others," Jack said, his eyes not leaving the screen. "Proceed." With a final, shuddering sigh, Croft clicked confirm. A small, green checkmark appeared on the screen. The first act of restitution was complete. "Good," Jack said. "Now, open the file." JUDGMENTXLS. Croft obeyed. The spreadsheet filled the screen. It was a monument to his own depravity. A list of names, 57 of them. Next to each name was a date, an address, and a column labeled Net Asset Value Extracted. The final column, added by Marcus, was labeled Restitution plus Punitive Damages. The numbers were staggering. "My God," Croft breathed, seeing the sum of his sins laid out in stark, digital black and white. "This will ruin me." "Ruin is a foreclosure notice and an empty refrigerator, Croft," Jack said, his voice laced with icy contempt. "This is a market correction. You're just on the wrong end of it for once. Start with the first name. Agnes Miller, widow of a CPO from the Korean War. You took her house 2 months ago. For the next 3 hours, Silas Croft, the master of financial manipulation, was forced to systematically dismantle his own empire. One by one, he initiated the transfers. With each click, a piece of his ill-gotten fortune was returned to those he had wronged. It was a slow, agonizing process, a digital water torture of his own making. Jack remained silent, a monolithic presence of judgment. He didn't gloat. He didn't threaten further. He simply watched, ensuring the task was completed. The justice being meted out was cold, efficient, and absolute. As Croft worked, his initial terror slowly curdled into a resentful, pleading desperation. "You don't understand," he whined, his voice cracking. "This isn't just me. There are partners, people who will not be happy about this. Give me their names," Jack said. Croft's mouth snapped shut. Betraying his victims was one thing. Betraying his co-conspirators was another level of risk he was not willing to take. "I thought not," Jack said. "Keep typing." Finally, the last transfer was made. The total was astronomical. Croft's face was ashen, his expensive suit rumpled. He looked like a man who had aged 20 years in 3 hours. He slumped back in his chair, a hollowed-out shell of the titan of industry he had been that morning. It's done, he croaked. Everything. It's all gone. Jack stood up. He walked over to the desk and looked down at the defeated man. Not everything, he said. He picked up Arthur's medals, which were still sitting on the desk, a silent testament to the day's purpose. He then turned his attention to the office itself. The hard drives. All of them. And the physical ledgers. Croft pointed a trembling finger toward a reinforced closet. In there, the server and the paper backups. Jack opened the closet. It was a small, climate-controlled room, much like the storage unit, but filled with blinking lights and stacks of black binders. He didn't need to understand the data. He just needed to secure it. He systematically unplugged the server, pulling the hard drives from their base. He gathered the binders. It was a heavy load. He piled it all on Croft's desk. This will be picked up, he said. An anonymous tip to the FBI's white-collar crime division. I imagine they'll be very interested in your accounting practices. And your partners. He looked at Croft one last time. The man was broken. Not physically, but in a way that was far more profound for a man like him. His wealth, his power, his shield of arrogance. It had all been stripped away. He was left naked and ruined. For a man whose entire identity was built on the illusion of success, it was a fate worse than death. This was neutralization, not elimination. Don't leave town, Jack said, his voice a final, chilling command. I'm sure the federal agents will want to have a word with you. Without another look, Jack turned and walked out of the office. The receptionist, who had been hovering nervously by her desk, shrank back as he passed. He walked to the elevator, the weight of the medals in his pocket the only thing he was taking with him. As he rode the elevator down, his phone buzzed. It was a text from Marcus. All transfers confirmed and routed. Funds are secure. The package is on its way to the appropriate authorities. Phase 1 complete. You have a new message from Asset Alpha. Asset Alpha? That was Marcus's designation for Arthur. Jack's brow furrowed. He called Marcus. What's the message? Jack asked. Havoc initiated contact, Marcus said. He's been barking at the door for 5 minutes straight. Not an aggression bark, an alert bark. Arthur says he keeps looking down the driveway. Says a car just pulled up. Jack's blood ran cold. Croft's partners. The blowback. It was coming sooner than he thought. What kind of car? Jack demanded, his voice tight, as he burst from the elevator and began jogging through the lobby. Arthur says it's not a cop car. It's a black sedan. Sleek. Expensive. Just like Croft's. I'm 40 minutes out, Marcus. Tell Arthur to stay away from the windows. Or the door. Don't let anyone in. A little late for that, Wrecker, Marcus said, his voice grim. Arthur said he went to the door before he called me. Said the man claimed to be from the bank. He opened it. Jack swore, a low, vicious curse. He broke into a run, pushing through the revolving doors of the office building and sprinting toward the parking garage where he'd left his truck. The mission wasn't over. He had won the battle, but the war had just followed him home. He had taken the Dragon's gold, and now the Dragon's friends were coming to collect. The F-250's engine roared to life, a guttural cry of anger that matched the tempest in Jack's soul. He tore out of the parking garage, ignoring the screech of tires and the angry honk of a taxi. He was a weapon, and he was pointed at home. 40 minutes. An eternity. He had to trust the only other soldier he had on the ground. Havoc, he whispered into the empty cab of the truck. Hold the line. Back at the farmhouse, the quiet peace had been shattered. The man at the door was not from the bank. He was built like a refrigerator, with a flat, broken nose and eyes that were as dead and empty as a shark's. He wore a suit that was too tight across his shoulders, and he had a shark-like smile that didn't touch his eyes. Arthur Pendleton, the man said, his voice a gravelly baritone. He pushed his way inside before Arthur could answer, forcing the old man to stumble backward. Mr. Croft sent me. He said you had a visitor today. We need to have a little chat about that. Havoc, who had been lying by the fire, was on his feet in an instant. A low, rumbling growl vibrated in his chest, a sound like an impending earthquake. He didn't bark. He didn't charge. He simply stood between the intruder and Arthur, a solid wall of muscle and teeth, his lips curled back to reveal a formidable arsenal of white daggers. The big man stopped. His shark-like smile faltered. He was used to intimidating old men, not 120-pound veteran K9S who looked at him like he was a chew toy. Nice doggy, the man said, taking a half step back. Why don't you put him away so we can talk? I think you should leave, Arthur said, his voice trembling but firm, emboldened by the sheer, unwavering menace of his protector. The man's eyes narrowed. I'm not leaving until I get what I came for. Croft's money, and the name of the guy who was here. He took a step forward. That was a mistake. Havoc didn't wait for a command. He had been given an order. Watch him. Stay. This man was a threat to his charge. With a roar that shook the small house, Havoc launched himself forward. He wasn't going for a kill. His training was more precise than that. He was a multi-purpose canine. He was trained to engage and subdue. He hit the man in the chest like a fur-covered missile, all momentum and mass. The man, as big as he was not prepared for the impact. He staggered backward with a surprised oof, his arms windmilling. Havoc used the momentum, his powerful jaws closing not on flesh, but on the man's forearm, the pressure immense but controlled. It was a takedown, not a mauling. The man screamed, a high-pitched shriek of pain and terror that was completely at odds with his tough guy exterior. He crashed backward through the front door he had just entered, landing in a heap on the porch, the massive dog still attached to his arm, growling and shaking his head, applying pressure, pinning him. Arthur stood in the doorway, his heart hammering against his ribs, watching in stunned silence. The loyal beast, the quiet companion, had become a guardian, a fury, a living embodiment of righteous violence. The sound of squealing tires echoed down the driveway. Jack's F-250 slid to a halt in a spray of gravel, the headlights pinning the chaotic scene on the porch in their bright, unforgiving glare. Jack was out of the truck before it had even stopped rocking, moving with a fluid, deadly grace. He took in the scene in a single, sweeping glance. The thug on the ground, Havoc in complete control, Arthur safe in the doorway. He walked up the steps, his face a grim, unreadable mask. He looked down at the whimpering man, who was now crying, tears of pain and fear streaming down his face. Get him off me! Get him off! The man shrieked. Jack knelt, not next to the man, but next to Havoc. He placed a hand on the dog's head. Havoc, off. Watch. With a final, warning growl, Havoc released his grip. His jaws were unstained with blood. He had held the man, not bitten through him. But the message was clear. He backed away a few feet and sat, his eyes never leaving the terrified thug, a low growl still rumbling in his chest. Jack looked at the man on the ground. He recognized the type. Hired muscle. A bully who was only brave when his victims were weaker. You have a message for Croft? Jack asked, his voice dangerously calm. The man just whimpered. Here's a message for you to take back to him, and to any of his other friends, Jack said. He leaned in close, his voice a whisper that was more menacing than any shout. This is over. The money is gone. The evidence is with the authorities. Arthur Pendleton and the others are under my protection now. If I see you, or anyone like you, within 100 miles of this house again, I will not send my dog. I will come myself. Do you understand me? The man nodded frantically, his eyes wide with terror. Get up, Jack commanded. The man scrambled to his feet, clutching his bruised and slobber-covered arm. Get off the X, Jack said, using a phrase the man wouldn't understand, but the tone was universal. Leave. Now. The thug didn't need to be told twice. He stumbled down the steps, scrambled into his sleek black sedan, and tore out of the driveway, his tires spinning in the loose gravel. He disappeared into the darkness, a coward fleeing the field of battle. Jack watched him go, then turned back to the house. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. He walked up the steps and stood before Arthur, who was looking at him with an expression of awe and profound gratitude. It's over, Jack said, his voice softer now. You're safe. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the cloth-wrapped bundle. He placed it in Arthur's trembling hands. I believe these belong to you, Sergeant Major. Arthur unwrapped the bundle. The firelight from the doorway caught the polished surfaces of the medals. The silver star, the bronze star, Eleanor's locket. He stared at them, his eyes filling with tears, not of sorrow this time, but of overwhelming relief and a restored sense of self. He looked up at Jack, his throat too thick with emotion to speak. Welcome home, soldier, Jack said quietly. He put a hand on Havoc's head, scratching him behind the ears. The dog leaned into his touch, his low growl finally subsiding into a contented sigh. The line had been held. The mission was, at last, complete. A new, quiet peace began to settle over the little farmhouse at the end of the road. The days that followed were a blur of quiet activity and profound change. The news of Silas Croft's downfall spread like wildfire through the state's veteran community, first as rumor, then as fact when the FBI, armed with the anonymous data package from Marcus, raided Croft's office and home. The story that trickled out was one of systemic fraud, and at the center of it, a list of 57 victims whose bank accounts had been mysteriously and miraculously replenished overnight. Jack remained at the farmhouse, a silent, watchful guardian. He and Arthur fell into a comfortable routine. Jack would handle the physical tasks, chopping wood from the plentiful supply he had delivered, making repairs to the old house, ensuring the pantry was always stocked. Arthur, his strength returning daily, would tell stories. He spoke of his time in the service, of the men he had known, the places he had seen. He spoke of Eleanor, of their life together, of the love that still filled the small house. He was no longer a victim. He was a survivor, a storyteller, a keeper of the flame. The return of his medals and his wife's locket had done more than any amount of money could. It had restored his dignity. It had given him back his past. One afternoon, a week after the confrontation, a dusty pickup truck, older and more battered than even Jack's, pulled into the driveway. Jack was instantly alert, but Havoc, after a single curious sniff of the air, gave a small, almost imperceptible wag of his tail. An elderly woman with kind eyes and a face etched with the lines of a hard-working life got out. She was holding a freshly baked apple pie. "Is this the place?" she asked, her voice raspy but warm. "Is this Arthur Pendleton's house?" She was Agnes Miller, the widow of the Korean War CPO, the first name on Marcus's list. She had driven 2 hours to say thank you. She didn't know who to thank, exactly. The news reports were vague, speaking only of an ongoing investigation and anonymous benefactors, but her house was safe. Her husband's memory was no longer tainted by the shame of almost losing it. She was the first of many. Over the next few weeks, a slow but steady pilgrimage began to the small farmhouse at the end of the gravel road. They came in old cars and trucks, veterans and their families, the other names from Croft's ledger of sorrow. They brought pies, casseroles, stories, and tears of gratitude. They didn't know Jack's role in their salvation, and he did nothing to enlighten them. He was just the quiet, imposing man in the background, the one who kept the fire going and made sure the coffee was always hot. They saw him as Arthur's friend, or perhaps a relative. To them, Arthur was the hero, the man who had somehow, impossibly, stood up to the darkness and won. Arthur, for his part, never betrayed Jack's secret. He simply accepted their gratitude on behalf of a justice that felt larger than any one person. The house, once a tomb of silence and cold, was now filled with life, with laughter, with the shared camaraderie of those who had served. One crisp December morning, a sleek, black van with government plates pulled into the drive. 2 men in suits got out. They were FBI. Jack met them on the porch. "We just have a few questions, Mr. Reardon," the senior agent said. His eyes were sharp, and they held a hint of weary respect. Off the record, of course. They knew. Marcus's digital footprints, as light as they were, had not been completely invisible to the top federal forensic analysts. They had a ghost, a whisper of a vigilante who had done their work for them before they even knew it needed to be done. "Arthur Pendleton is a war hero," Jack said, his voice flat. "He was being preyed upon. Now he's not." The agent nodded slowly. "The hard drives you recovered have given us enough to put Croft and his associates away for a very long time. There were some very unpleasant people involved. People who make Silas Croft look like a choir boy. You took a big risk." "I assessed the risk," Jack replied. "It was acceptable." The agent almost smiled. He looked past Jack, at the warm light spilling from the windows of the repaired farmhouse, at the thin curl of smoke rising from the chimney. "A lot of good people are sleeping better at night because of what you did. We can't officially condone your methods, but thank you." They got back in their van and drove away, closing a chapter Jack had never intended to write. A few months later, as the first signs of spring began to thaw the frozen ground, a letter arrived. It was addressed to the Pendleton Project. a name that had sprung up organically from the community of veterans who now gathered at the farmhouse once a month for a potluck and a support meeting. The letter was from Marcus. It contained a cashier's check for a very large sum of money. The memo line read, "Anonymous donation from the liquidated assets of Patriot Holdings, LLC. With the funds, Arthur and the others formed a nonprofit foundation." The Pendleton Project's mission was simple: to provide emergency financial aid, legal assistance, and a community network for veterans who found themselves falling through the cracks. Their first official act was to hire a full-time director. The job was offered to Jack. He was sitting on the porch with Arthur, Havoc snoozing in a patch of sunlight at his feet, when the offer was made. "We need you, son," Arthur said. "We need a man who knows how to get things done. A man who isn't afraid." Jack looked out over the fields, which were just beginning to show hints of green. He looked at the old soldier beside him, his friend. He looked down at the loyal beast who had started it all, who had refused to leave the mailbox, who had sounded the alarm. He had come to these mountains seeking silence, an escape from the world. He had found something else entirely. A purpose, a mission that didn't end, a new squad, a new brotherhood. He thought of Dave, his lost brother in arms. For the first time, the memory didn't bring a fresh stab of pain. Instead, he felt a sense of peace. He had held the line. He had left no one behind. "Okay, Arthur," Jack said, a rare, small smile touching his lips. "I'll do it, but I'm going to need a good second in command." He reached down and scratched Havoc behind the ears. The big dog opened one amber eye, thumped his tail once against the porch, and went back to sleep. His work was done. He had brought his soldier home. The sun warmed Jack's face. The ghosts were quiet. The war was over, and a new day was beginning.